So to start for today, think about two different kinds of games, Go and chess. So Go is this Chinese game. It was invented probably 2,500 years ago. It's one of the oldest games in the world that people still play. Super simple. There's like two rules. You basically just want to surround the other person's pieces, then they're trapped. Um, so all your pieces behave the same, like in checkers. You make the same moves with all your pieces, right? So it's super simple. Uniformity of all the pieces, very few rules, but you can do a lot with it. The game lasts a long time and there's lots of strategy you can do. Um, Chess, first of all, is much more recent. It was probably invented um, maybe 1,000 years ago or so in India and then brought back to Europe um, through various things. Um, Chess has a lot more rules, and part of the reason it has so many rules is because it has so many different kinds of pieces, like knights, bishops, kings, queens, pawns. It's not as systematized, right? It has a lot more stuff that you have to keep straight than Go does. Um, or think about, I was thinking about political positions too. Think about the difference between libertarians and socialists, right? Among the many differences, libertarians pretty much they want to do as much with one rule as they can, right? They've got this one rule. They want lots of individual freedoms for people. And um, so they strive for this consistency across all these issues like should we legalize drugs? Should we legalize prostitution? Should we have borders? No, we should get rid of everything that gets in the way of individual freedoms as much as possible, right? Um, Socialists, I mean, they're interested in individual freedom. They're also interested in redistributing control over production, right? So that workers are in charge of their workspace and stuff like that. So that's two principles, freedom and who is in charge of the workspace. And then a lot of times they're interested in sort of ensuring a certain quality of life for everybody, right? So they like programs designed to promote welfare. So that's at least three different things they're trying to do. They want freedom, they want distribution of workplace control, they want like a base standard of living for everybody, right? Kind of like the difference between Go and chess. And that's the basic difference that Isaiah Berlin is pointing to in The Hedgehog and the Fox. He talks a lot about authors like Dostoevsky, Dante, and Shakespeare, and all these people. Um, but he's talking about a really general heuristic, and it's just a heuristic. He doesn't think it's like a perfect um, category or anything. Um, he calls them hedgehogs and foxes because of this old Greek proverb. Um, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing, right? So the hedgehog is going to be more like the Go player, more like the libertarian. A hedgehog, according to Isaiah Berlin, is somebody who wants to make sense of reality by finding a principle that they can organize reality under, right? They want to explain as much as possible with as few principles as possible. They want a lot of organization. They think their job is to simplify all this messy, confusing stuff, right? The fox thinks the way to make sense of reality is to capture as much detail as possible. So the fox is going to be okay with more clutter. They're going to be okay with a greater number of principles, right? They don't have to boil it all down to one rule, right? You can think about it as maybe the difference between sort of, again, the difference between libertarianism, where you've got one rule, the difference between socialism, where you have a bunch that you're trying to keep straight. Um, so a couple things, right? You might think, oh, I have had students think this before. You might think, so that means the hedgehog is less open-minded and the fox is more flexible and open-minded and chill. Well, that's not necessarily the case, right? Um, I don't know if you've ever known somebody like this. I had a roommate for a while who he was always sort of trying new diets, getting new books about like how to win friends and influence people, that kind of stuff, right? He always wanted to have one thing in his life that would make sense of everything else, right? But it wasn't always the same thing. Like one week he'd be like, "Oh, I'm doing keto now." Then the next week he'd be like, "Oh, I'm doing intermittent fasting." It was just all over the place. Um, so it's it's not necessarily the case that if you're a hedgehog, you're really stuck in your ways and you're closed-minded. It just means that you think the way to make sense of the world is to find one organizing principle that can make sense of a bunch of things, right? If you're a fox, you think it's sort of about how many things can I capture, right? Um, you can find a bunch of internet articles on the hedgehog and the fox, but I don't recommend it because even when you can understand them, a lot of times they're so poorly written, they don't mean anything. Um, Lots of business people really like this. There's lots of business websites where they're like, here's how you get ahead in the office and get that new job and get promoted. Be a hedgehog or be a fox. They usually don't make sense because they don't know what they're talking about. And sometimes they say, oh, the hedgehog is a generalist and the fox is a specialist. Or they'll say the opposite because, again, they don't know. It's not about whether you're a generalist or a specialist either. You could know a lot of things and be a hedgehog. It's just that you try to organize them in terms of one big thing, right? Um, it really is just that if you're a hedgehog, you're going to ask, how much can I do with this one principle? That's your question. And if you're a fox, your question is, how many principles do I need to capture this much detail, right? That's the difference. This is actually, I think, kind of useful. It's a useful thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about the different ways people make sense of stuff. Why do I have it in this class? Because as you're going to see, there's some disagreement about how to do ethics. The first two theories we're going to look at, utilitarianism and Kantianism, super hedgehog. They want to make sense of everything in terms of as few principles as possible. Then we're going to look at virtue ethics and care ethics. And their whole thing is, hey, the moral life is really complicated. Let's try to capture as many of the various conflicting aspects of it as we can, even if we can't boil everything down to one rule, like the utilitarians or the Kantians try to do, right? So you're going to find it a useful framework as we study some of these theories. So that's the basic idea. Hedgehogs, one big principle. Foxes, capture as many details as you can. And then in the next lecture, we'll talk about Plato and Aristotle. And if you notice, Isaiah Berlin thinks that Plato was a hedgehog and Aristotle was a fox. Not sure if that's true. Either way, you're going to see sort of similar points. You're going to see this play out in the specific parts of them that we look at. So you'll see right away this applies to some of the other stuff we're looking at. All right, well, I will see you in the next lecture. Be sure to stay in touch.